Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue sur la chaîne de l'Association française des douleurs et symptômes neuroplastiques. Aujourd'hui, j'ai l'honneur d'accueillir Dan Ratner. Dan est docteur en psychologie clinique, ce qui aux États-Unis correspond à un doctorat professionnel axé sur la pratique thérapeutique. Il exerce en cabinet privé à New York depuis 2007 et il est également président du conseil d'administration de l'ATNS, organisation fondée par le docteur David Clark qui œuvre à faire reconnaître et traiter les symptômes neuroplastiques à l'échelle internationale. Dan a lui-même vécu 8 ans de douleurs chroniques invalidantes. C'est cette expérience personnelle et combinée à sa formation en neurosciences et en psychologie qui l'a amené à développer sa propre méthode thérapeutique, notamment la technique des 3 colonnes, et il est l'auteur de Crushing Doubt, publié en 2025. Dan, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous. Thank you and welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dan.
Thanks, Jasmine. That was the most beautiful introduction because of the French language, so I appreciate that.
Good. There was a lot more to say, but I'm sure we will develop throughout the interview. Il y avait beaucoup d'autres choses à dire et je pense qu'on pourra parler plus longuement de votre parcours pendant l'interview. So the first question is, how did you build your work over the years? What tools do you use? And what makes your approach so personal, even as it is rooted in neuroscience and psychology? Comment avez-vous construit votre travail au fil des années? Quels sont vos outils? Et qu'est-ce qui rend votre approche si personnelle, même si elle est ancrée dans les neurosciences et la psychologie?
So, the place I usually start with this is I built my work first based on how I could get better. So, when I discovered mind body experience or neuroplastic experience, whatever we want to call it, there's many different terms, but it all means the same thing, which is that the mind is controlling what happens in the body and controlling these symptoms. Just the information alone was incredibly helpful. So, I don't know how many of your viewers will know Dr. Jean Sarno, but he was a medical doctor working at NYU, and I had no idea about him. I had 8 years of chronic everyday back pain, and I had no idea I was going to get better. I just was on the same path, trying all kinds of things, and I ended up building my work based on what got me better. So the first thing is that I needed information, and I was shocked to find there was this information at all. I also was shocked to find how little people knew about this information. It was incredibly eye opening. So, the first step in building my work was simply thinking, well, if this information was so transformational for me, how do I get it to people? And just to make it clear, what was this information? This was basically information that was telling me that my physical experience was not only from structural issues, it wasn't only from physical issues. It was not a pure physical experience. Yes, it was physical, but it was being driven primarily by a very strong belief that I had been fed by doctors and by my own experience that was telling me I was injured and I was not going to get better and there was nothing to do about it. And all of that fear was driving my mind to generate all kinds of chemicals and fight or flight response in my body. And it was driving all of the symptoms to go really, really high. But I didn't know that's what was causing it. I had no idea. So when I read about Dr. John Sarno, that was the first exposure I got to information that was telling me that that was what was happening. And it moved me out of thinking about, a fragile body or an injured body. It completely changed the way I was thinking about it. And just that change alone started to shift the symptoms. So when you ask me, how did I build my work? It's foundational to my work that it's educational, it's scientific, it's logical. And ultimately what I found is the only way that I could change my bodily experience was changing my mental experience. And to change my mental experience, I needed new information that made sense. So I built my system around the things that made sense to me. Now, you asked me what tools do I use and how is it so personal? Let me start with the personal part. The reason my work is so personal is that I know that when it comes to neuroplastic suffering, which is it starts in the brain and really channels all kinds of different things into the body, you can't get that under control without it being personal. And I'll tell you why. Because it is the mind of the sufferer that determines what happens in their bodies. If you are afraid that you have an injured back, that's where the pain's going to be. If you are afraid that you have an injured knee, that's where the pain is going to be. If you have a fear that you have a problem with your digestive system, that's where the symptoms are going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So it has to be personal because we have to change the mind of the sufferer to change these kinds of symptoms. Now, I also do want to say there are medical issues. There are physical symptoms that come purely through physicality. If you run into a brick wall, it's going to hurt. If something heavy falls on you, that's going to hurt. Violent injuries can lead to actual physical injuries, but they don't linger. They have a healing process. So when it lasts longer and it keeps dragging on and you don't have an explanation, that's a sign that it is likely to be neuroplastic or mind-body. And so I had to develop all kinds of tools for myself. And one of the first things that I discovered, Jasmine, was that it was primarily not just my thinking, but also my feelings that were driving things. So if you read Dr. Sarno, he talks a lot about the emotional experience and how that emotional experience can channel its way into the body, including unconscious emotions. So we can get into that a little bit later. But it was also about the thinking. And I had to learn to separate out, well, which one was driving which symptom. So my 8 years of back pain wasn't really driven by emotions. The onset of that back pain was driven by emotions, the beginning. But for 8 years, what really was driving the symptoms was how I was thinking about it. I was thinking I was injured. I was being told I was injured. I had no sense of any reason I was going to get better, which was terrifying. And that fear and that thought process was just continuing and perpetuating what was happening in my body. So let me get a little bit to the tools that I use. And this is some high level stuff, so we're jumping in right at the beginning. But I developed a system that was based on what worked for me. And ultimately, I found that there were 3 areas that I needed to focus on: thinking, feeling, and my relationship with myself. And I developed this into a system. I call it the column system. It's just basically dividing things up into 3 columns when you write it on a piece of paper. That's where that name comes from. But what it's designed to do is to help you understand your neuroplastic or mind-body moments. What's happening now? Is my thinking driving this? Is my feeling driving it? Is my relationship with myself driving this? And if you can understand that, you can understand what's happening in specific, which then allows you to figure out what are you going to do about it. So I have something called action steps. And these are specific ways of thinking or acting that get us into a different mindset. It's a very active experience once you understand what is happening. What am I going to do here?
Could we do a little
Sure.
live example of the 3 columns, just so people understand it? It's in your book. Est-ce qu'on peut tester votre méthode des 3 colonnes, juste pour qu'on voit comment ça se passe?
Sure. So, Jasmine, why don't we do this? I can give you kind of some sample experiences that people can have,
Mhm.
and I can tell you how I think about it in terms of my columns.
Mhm.
When I do this, it might be helpful to say this at the outset. These columns that I think of in terms of thinking, feeling, and relationship with self, I have certain names for them that I developed that I found helpful for me. And when I started trying it out with others, I was very pleased to find it wasn't just helpful for me; it's helpful for others. So when we talk about feelings, I call that the emotions column. When we talk about thinking, I call it the doubt column, because people have doubts about things. They're just not sure, and they need to get their thinking sure. And when it comes to relationship with the self, I call it the power column. The power column is a way of feeling at peace with the self, self-aligned, good inside. And I don't mean good like happy every moment. I just mean at rest with the self.
Mhm.
So when you hear me talk about those columns, that's probably the language that's the language that I would use. If you prefer me to use different language for your audience, just let me know. Okay?
Mhm.
So let's use an example. Let's say somebody comes to me and they say, I've had shoulder pain for 2 years and I just can't seem to do anything about it. Every time I move in this particular way, it hurts. Every time I do this, it hurts. I've noticed that it sometimes like aches more at certain times and not others, but I don't know what that's about. So the first thing that I would do is do a little bit of the educational piece, share the information, because if they don't understand what I'm talking about, it's not going to help too much. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they've already done the educational work. They've already opened themselves up to this idea
Mhm.
that the mind and brain can cause symptoms in the body.
Mhm.
If they haven't, well, then we talk it through until they feel like they've got it. But let's say they've done that. And I will say to them, okay, you've had 2 years of shoulder pain.
Mhm.
2 years of shoulder pain tells me the start of that shoulder pain may have been about something emotional. I should say the start of that shoulder pain doesn't always have to be emotional, though. It could be that they suffered an injury
Mhm.
and then the injury just never got better. Now,
Mhm.
I'll get into how those two things are different.
Mhm.
But when symptoms linger longer than the normal healing process, that immediately makes me think it's the thinking, the doubt column. So I would get right to the doubt column work there. And I
Mhm.
would say to them, okay, tell me what you're thinking. Let's get these thoughts put into words. And so when they put them into words, they could say, well, I just think I'm getting older. Or I think that when I injured it, it needs surgery to get better. I'm not saying any of that's true, but people have these different thoughts.
Mhm.
And if they continue to have those thoughts, guess what happens?
Mhm.
The link between the brain and the body stays in exactly the same place.
Mhm. Can I
And
understand why
so,
you didn't go through the emotions column first with them? Can you explain that to our listeners?
yep. Yeah. So emotions can cause what I call the onsets and upticks in symptoms. But emotions change all the time.
Mhm.
If you think about the day you're having or the day you just had, you went through thousands of different emotions.
Mhm.
Emotions don't stay in the same place. Thinking tends to stay in the same place unless we are given reason to change our thinking.
Mhm.
So, when symptoms stay in the same place for a very long time or longer than the normal recovery process of something, what that tells me is there may have been an emotion that was causing things at first, but if it's lasting that long, it's thinking. So, in this case, I'm starting with the doubt column.
Mhm.
Now, I will say, if people are saying to me, I've had shoulder pain for 2 years, but it is much worse at night, or it's
Mhm.
much worse some of the time, it varies a lot.
Mhm.
That's where I'd actually probably would say, okay, wait, we could look at the emotions here
Mhm.
because I say it's the onsets and upticks in symptoms. So if you have shoulder pain that's lasted 2 years, but there's upticks, that's where we could look at the emotions. What's going on underneath that leads to pain, symptoms, whatever it is. So why don't I get into an emotions column example?
Mhm.
I can continue with that story. By the way, we could say this same person who had two
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that?
Yeah.
So let's say I say, okay, you've had this for 2 years. I'd like to work on the doubt, and then they actually say to me, well, actually, I don't have that much doubt. I think this is neuroplastic,
Mhm.
but I just don't really know what's going on. I don't know why it goes up and down so much. When I hear up and down, I'm starting to think, well, now wait a minute, what's happening emotionally?
Mhm.
So with someone like that, I might say, okay, when was the last time you had a big uptick? And they might say to me, oh, yeah, it was at this family event, but nothing was going on. I don't know. I'm
Everything
making
is
all this up.
fine.
Yeah, everything's fine. I
Everything's
felt good.
fine.
I felt good, but my shoulder was killing me.
Yeah.
So to me, one way to think about this is that the body is part of the mind. In fact, they're one. So your body is often expressing things. Some people express through their bodies much more than others.
Mm.
I'm one of them. My body's always expressing things. And one of the ways I've come to understand that is, we all develop in different ways psychologically, but a lot of times when there was a lot going on in our early childhood years, a lot of it was nonverbal. So your body is your language.
Mhm.
And so I would start looking at what's the language saying. I might say to them, okay, what was going on in that um, family get together? What was happening? And they might say, yeah, it was funny. Again, totally making this up. Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to my aunt,
Mhm.
and she said this thing about, she was worried about her getting
Mhm.
older.
Mhm.
And, I did. And it was during that conversation. I don't know what was going on, but it was a perfectly lovely conversation.
Mhm.
What that's telling us is the body knows something that the
Mhm.
conscious mind doesn't.
Mhm.
And my job in the emotions column is to start linking up what your body is saying, to start using that
Yeah.
as part of conscious experience.
Because it's so hard. Everybody's, when we're on a day-to-day experience, we're just on the surface level. And it's hard to be at the same time analyzing what you're going through, really, having the self-awareness. It's really about being, self-aware of what your inner processes are going through, your emotions. And most of the times we're just caught in this autopilot and self-awareness was left at home and we just go through all these emotions and we don't we just sometimes we just push through them or we ignore them, we suppress them, and most of the time we just want to put a mask on and put a face, a happy face. It's like maybe your example, he was talking to his aunt and maybe he did feel a little twitch, but he didn't want to, he wasn't taught to, what do you do? So you just push through and you smile and then you forget, but you never really forget. Is that kind of, c'est un peu comme ça en fait. On est tout le
Yeah.
temps en train d'avancer avec un masque quand on est dans des événements ou par exemple dans cet exemple où le monsieur est en train de discuter avec sa tante et tout d'un coup il y a un sujet qui semble banal, mais il n'a pas appris à faire une pause. Et comment on fait une pause par rapport à ce qu'on peut ressentir à l'intérieur, hein, que ça soit une émotion ou quelque chose au niveau du corps? On va continuer, on va pousser, on va aller de l'avant. Et on va pas prendre le temps de dire, tiens, mais j'ai ressenti ça tout à l'heure. Ça reste quelque part. So it stays somewhere.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that we all have to do this. We're managing so many different things.
Mm.
Let's just take that example.
Yeah.
If your aunt's talking about mortality and her own worries, maybe you don't want to worry her with your own worries.
Mm-hmm.
She's already worried enough. So you start to take
Mm-hmm.
care of her and you
Mm-hmm.
smile, you say everything's going to be fine, but inside yourself you're thinking, "Oh my god, someday that's going to be me." And then you're all
Mm.
worried about it.
Mm.
And if that's not even something you're consciously aware of, your body might express it.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, your
Exactly.
stomach doesn't feel so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Suddenly, you're having a pain somewhere, or
Yeah.
suddenly your eyes have gotten blurry or dry.
Yeah.
Um, so let me say this: when the thinking changes in the doubt column, the symptoms can start to shift around and ease, and eventually they'll just go away. Sometimes it can happen actually really quickly if doubt comes down really fast, and there's certain, I know this is what it is. I can see why I'm going to get better. In the emotions column, if you pinpoint what was going on and you make that unconscious experience conscious, the symptom can vanish. So if doubt is still in the picture, that may not happen. But if your doubt's low and you discover the emotion, you can make those symptoms go away really fast. And that's what I've learned. I don't have any chronic symptoms anymore. And I manage acute symptoms all the time through these methods. But I want to say one thing. A lot of times when people hear about the emotions column, they think that's going to take too long. I can't be thinking that way all the time. I have a life to live. And I get that. What I will say is the columns are actually designed to make things faster, much quicker discovery. Get there faster because you have a life to live. You can't spend all of your time analyzing things. So I just wanted to note that. Now, let's get to that last column, the power
Mm-hmm.
column. The power column is about your relationship with yourself. And when you are in a situation where there's a lot of conflict with yourself, that can also lead to symptoms. I will say, if doubt is nice and low and you've got good emotional awareness, those symptoms tend to be pretty low level, but I call them symptom plateaus, where you've
Mm-hmm.
got the symptom much lower, but it just isn't going away. You don't
Mm-hmm.
feel totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sign of a power column struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that look like? A power column struggle looks like either you're in a situation or you're having a thought process within yourself that just isn't aligned with yourself. So let's go back to that talk with the ant that I'm completely making up. And my ants are lovely, by the way. They're not causing many problems for me whatsoever. But let's say in that conversation, the ant is putting down something that's really important to you. And you have never told anyone how important that is to you. A great example of this actually is I play guitar, I sing, music's very important to me. But in my family of origin, music was much more important to me than any of the other people, more than my dad, my mom, or my brother. And I always felt very isolated about that. I didn't feel like I could be fully myself. I didn't feel like I could tell them how important it was because they kept downplaying it, or they kept not seeing it. It kept hurting when they wouldn't see it. And so that was a misalignment with myself. I had to learn to basically say, no, this is really important to me. You guys don't understand. And even if I couldn't get them to understand, it was important that I stood my ground within myself to be aligned with myself, to say, no, I'm having a lonely process that you don't know about, instead of just letting it go. Now, I'm not saying to cause problems all the time and talk about everything, but because sometimes it's not even about talking about with the other people directly. It's just about recognizing who you are and recognizing why things bother you, or why they hurt you, or why they're important to you, or why you need a boundary in place. So it's about changing. It's about making the adjustments. One way that I say it is that the doubt column is about the thinking, and the emotions column is about emotional awareness. It's about a quick way to get aware. The power column is where we make emotional adjustments. So it's an emotional column too, but it's where we make adjustments. What am I going to do about this? How am I going to live differently? So I'll just leave it at that for now. There's lots more we can discuss about it.
So if we could just finish with that example, this man talking to his aunt, how would the doubt column come into play?
Okay, so in the example, she's talking about fears about getting older, and the person, the individual that I guess is me in this example, is thinking, well, I'm going to get older too. I'm freaking out about this. So in the doubt column, I talk about you've got to call those thoughts into question. That's the very first thing. I call it observing doubt. Call it into question. Be like, well, yes, I am aging, but does aging necessarily lead to pain? Now, if we know enough about what the actual literature says about this, we know that aging is not correlated to pain. It really isn't. I understand why some people think that it is, but the fact is, degenerative processes don't cause pain.
Right. And
so that's the way I'd be talking to myself.
Yeah,
to bring
exactly.
that out.
And then the power column, how would he get out of that situation through the power column?
So power column, I made it a little confusing because I brought up two different examples. I'll give you a way out for both. So, with the power column, when it comes to, let's say, mortality and fears about death, one way that people can work on their power is to settle a question in their mind about, well, what do I think about spirituality, or what happens after death, or living a good life. And they can get to a place where they're like, you know what, I don't have to fear this so much because I actually like my life. And they can get back to enjoying it. That's an adjustment in that part of things. Let's say it was the music example, though. Let's say the aunt said something about music and it's not important. And that could go any number of different directions. It could be that they actually say something to that end and say, hey, listen, you're important to me and I know I'm important to you. I don't think you realize how important music is to me. Can I tell you about it? And if it's a good conversation, the aunt might say, oh, I didn't know. Tell me. And then you start to talk about.
So is it about assertiveness? It's about really like defining who you are and being clear with yourself about who you are and where you want to be. It's about defining your values.
Yes, but I will say it's much more important what happens internally than externally. It does not matter if other people get it. If you feel you know who you are and you like who that person is, your whole body will start to relax. It just feels good.
The people that come to you with neuroplastic pain, this is one of the tools that you will use. And this is one of the fastest and most efficient tools that you have to actually get them to recover fully.
Yeah, I think maybe the most helpful way I could respond to that is just to say that I think of these three columns as one tool. They're one tool to assess each and every moment and to figure out which column's the dominant column right now. What do I need to do within that column, and how can I get answers? So the column system is a way of identifying a problem and finding a solution.
Yeah. Si vous avez des questions par rapport à ce travail des trois colonnes que Dan a créé, n'hésitez pas à laisser des messages, je lui transmettrai. So the next question is, your work draws from different schools of psychology. from psychoanalysis to neuroscience. What are the limits of psychoanalysis in your view, whether for neuroplastic conditions specifically or as a general therapeutic approach? Dan étant psychologue, il a un doctorat en psychologie. Son travail aujourd'hui s'inspire de différentes écoles de psychologie, de la psychanalyse aux neurosciences. Et donc la question, c'est quelles sont les limites de la psychanalyse selon vous, que ce soit pour les troubles neuroplastiques spécifiquement ou comme approche thérapeutique globale?
Okay, so Jasmine, I'll start by saying this. This is something we could do an entire podcast episode on by
Yeah,
itself. There's so
I
much in it.
think so.
So
I think
just
so.
take this as like the tip of the iceberg on this
Yeah,
one.
I think we could say that about every question, Dan.
I think that's actually
Je pense qu'on
true.
pourrait faire une interview sur chaque question.
The reason I said that, I think that's true about every question, but the reason I said it about this particular question is that we're, I think, at an interesting point in the field of, in all of these fields, in medicine, in psychology, in neuroscience. There's a lot that's changing, actually. We're understanding so much more about what we didn't understand. And this happens again and again. You know, in the last, I'd say 20 years or so within psychology, there's been a lot of work done on being trauma informed, understanding the impact of trauma, how it plays out, what trauma activations are like. And in my experience, and I have pretty vast experience in this, my grandma was a psychoanalyst. My aunt was a psychoanalyst, actually. I went to a psychoanalytic kindergarten where, you know, I was learning about this from the start.
That's a thing. Ça
It
existe.
is.
Un jardin d'enfants psychanalytique.
It's pretty rare, but I did. And it was partly because of the experiences that I had growing up with some trauma, which we can get into if you'd like. But I also had a childhood analysis. Then I went to an analyst as a young adult. Then I had an adult analysis. I mean, I'm very well experienced in analysis. And what I came to see is there are some really big limitations. There's some great stuff in there. I'm not saying it's all bad. Some incredibly important ideas. Going back to the beginning, even with Freud, there were some really incredible ideas. In fact, we already talked about the unconscious. So I don't want to be ungrateful to the psychoanalytic tradition for all of the great things that they have brought to us, but they didn't. I think that they didn't continue to develop in certain ways, especially in like a classical analytic model. They took on certain viewpoints, but they stopped asking questions. They stopped being curious about certain things. Now, when I say they, I know a lot of people haven't. There are some great psychoanalysts who have continued to be curious and continued to grow, or incorporated trauma-informed work. The columns are another extension of that, though. You know, one of the very big limitations that I see in most psychoanalytic treatments is that they don't understand that neuroplastic experience is a psychological defense. They are only interpreting things cognitively and emotionally, and they're leaving the body out entirely. But the body is our original language. So one of the main limitations is that they don't understand generally. I'm not speaking for every psychoanalyst, but generally speaking, they don't understand. If there's shoulder pain, they'll say it sounds like you need to see a medical doctor.
But didn't, for example, Freud, and I'm not at all a specialist, but didn't, for example, Freud talk about hysteria when he talked about women who were having various symptoms? Freud lui-même a parlé d'hystérie en parlant des femmes qui avaient des symptômes qui pouvaient être neuroplastiques. And those symptoms could have very well been, and they probably were, neuroplastic.
Oh, I think they absolutely were. In fact, Freud earlier in his career was more onto this. He talked a lot about the fact that the mental process was changing things in the body. When he developed the theory of hysteria, he actually went the wrong direction with it. Mm-hmm. And that's what feeds the idea that these symptoms are in your head, made up. They're not. They're from your head. Mm-hmm. They're not in your head. They start with your head. They become real in the body. And when Freud developed the theory of hysteria, he lost his way on that part. Mm-hmm. And some of his followers knew it. Alfred Adler went totally the other direction. He thought, no, these are real physical processes. They're coming from emotional experience. Now, they were focused on the emotions more than the thinking, but it doesn't matter so much for our purposes today talking about this because it's the mind that was generating these things. But there were Franz Alexander was another follower of Freud that did not believe it was hysteria. He believed it was essentially what is called a psychosomatic process.
Mm-hmm.
Totally real symptoms, real physical symptoms. And we already know that real physical symptoms can happen all over the place. When you cry,
Yeah.
it's happening because you're having a feeling and your
Mm-hmm.
tear ducts actually change. Or if you
Mm-hmm.
blush, you get
Mm-hmm.
embarrassed, your blood flow actually changes. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we know about tension headaches. We call it an upset stomach. We have all these very strong signs that the mind affects the body. And when Freud talked about hysteria, I think he that actually was probably his own psychological defense. If I can analyze Freud here for a bit, I think he didn't want to know the fullness of that connection, and that mistake has continued in psychoanalysis. There's other limitations I could say for psychoanalysis. I'll say just a couple, and then we can dive into whatever direction you want. But to me, one of the key things that psychoanalysis doesn't have right, aside from trauma-informed work, which is very important, but different topic, I find that the classical psychoanalytic tradition, anyway, doesn't afford enough respect to the conscious mind of the sufferer. They don't trust the people they work with enough. And when I say they, I'm talking very broadly, because I'm sure there are tons of great analysts. In my book, though, I write about one who was not so great.
Mm-hmm.
I saw him in my
You
adult.
saw him for a very long time.
I saw him for 9.5 years, and I
Yeah.
kept thinking, wow, this guy thinks all these things about me. And I wasn't trusting myself. So that's where the power column was invented, right in that experience, where I was having this 9.5 years of analyzing things and taking in how this guy was seeing me. And I kept thinking, this does not fit with what I know.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I really love about the columns is they help us learn to trust the person that we're working with. And they help that person learn to trust themselves, because the body is never going to lie.
Mm.
It's just expressing, it's like the most direct expression of what's going on in our unconscious experience we can have. In fact, in psychoanalytic tradition, there's a lot of analyzing dreams, which I have found very helpful. But I call symptoms a waking dream. They are, while we're awake, giving us signs of the unconscious experience.
Mm-hmm. So much information.
Yeah. So I think, one of the main limitations in psychoanalysis right now is they're missing a lot of information that actually, if they really are thinking about their own traditions, fits right in.
We could continue that talk, but we're very limited by the time, and so we have to move on to the next question.
Have to come on another time.
Yeah, we have to continue this talk. One of the questions I wanted to ask you about the symptoms was, what does it mean when you say symptoms have a function or trying to communicate something?
All right. So I'm glad we talked about the columns before, because that can couch this particular answer. Each column, the symptoms have a different function. So in the emotions column, because they're unconscious emotional experience, that which we don't know about definitionally to what's unconscious, the function of the symptom is to create a distraction from that emotional discovery. So the symptom comes up at the moment of emotional upset, because we don't want to know about the emotional upset. The symptom comes in, it distracts us. That's the symptom function when it comes to emotions, which is why onsets and upticks tend to happen, because at that moment, we don't want to know about that emotion. So it's distraction is the symptom function in the emotions column. In the doubt column, the symptom function is totally different. I shouldn't say totally different, because there's some one piece of overlap, but generally it's different. And that is that the symptom function is protection. You are a thinking being, and you are always scanning for what are the dangers out there. We learn that from an early age. Babies or young kids, when they're learning to walk, they learn there's danger. If I bump into this, I could hurt my head. If I fall, it could hurt my arm. We're always looking for danger. But doubt is looking for danger all over the place, and it is the most worried entity you could find. It's worried about everything. And if it's worried about everything, it worries about too much. And then we become overprotective. And we start thinking, well, I can't do this and I can't do that. I was just talking to somebody who's in a basketball league that I run. He's 29 years old and he's talking about he's getting older and he's having aches and pains. And I'm like, no, that's not what's going on. At 29 years old, that should not be happening. My back pain started when I was 28, so I know this well. But he's starting to think in protective terms. You know what? I need to do more stretches. I need to be more careful. I need to not run as many games as I was running before. And we start to build in this sense of tentativeness and caution with our physicality because of doubt. So there's a protective function. But I'll say one more thing about it. Doubt wants to protect from everything. It wants to protect from emotional discovery too. So if the emotions column is distracting us from a symptom, doubt can pile on top of it to make it even harder to discover that.
And so what is the difference to you between doubt and fear? Quelle est la différence pour vous entre le doute et la peur?
So fear is one of the four forms of doubt. I say the four forms of doubt are fear, confusion, lack of certainty, and unanswered questions. And if you think about it, there's a spectrum here. The worst kind of doubt is fear. You can barely even think during it. You think you need the most protection when you have fear. But if you can bring fear down and start to be like, wait, hold on, I can think about this. The next step would be confusion. Confusion's not fun, but it's better than fear. You're like, I don't understand what's happening.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not afraid anymore. I can talk about it. I can look at it, but I'm just not sure what to think.
Yeah, but still totally lost, need a lot of information. So confusion is a part of doubt where the educational piece is important. Lack of certainty it sounds a lot like confusion, but it's a much lower level version of it. It's more like, okay, I'm not so confused anymore, but I don't totally understand certain elements. It's just a lower level of that. And then unanswered questions, it's even more honed that way. It's like, I'm not afraid. I'm not confused. I'm pretty certain this is what's going on, but I need to understand this one little thing. I'll give you an example. When I was getting better, one of my unanswered questions was, I understand that the brain can change the body in these ways. And I understand that's what's happening in me. And I understand that ultimately I'm going to be fine. You can hear the fear was down, the confusion was down. I was pretty certain even. But I had this question. How does the brain do it? So you mentioned, the neuroscience part of my work. So I had to find out how it does it. And what I found out through investigation is that the hormone system can send chemical messengers from the brain to any part of the body and order it to do whatever it wants them to do. So if the body already has the function, it can cry, it can bleed, it can itch, it can have pain response, it can have gastrointestinal distress. It can already do those functions. And the brain can tell those cells to do whatever. So I needed to know what the mechanism was. When I discovered that's what it was, that answered the question for me. And guess what? That made me even more certain. And my doubt came down even further. And then that gave me room to do the emotional work underneath. Now, I want to cycle back to the function question because I didn't get to the power column function, which is about communication, which was your initial question. The power column is a column where the symptom function isn't distraction like it is in the emotions column, and it isn't protection like it is in the doubt column. It's communication. There is a part of us that wants to know what the unconscious already knows. It's trying to get us the information. And this is actually one of the limitations of classical psychoanalysis, I'll say. They view the patient as someone who does not want to know things. But we're more than that. We are people who sometimes don't want to know things, yes. And we're also people who do want to know things. We want to know it. We want to be synced up. We do not feel good when we're out of sync with ourselves. So the communication of the symptoms, which is something you discover much more when doubt is down and you've got a lot of the emotional awareness, then you can start to discover what is the communication. And that's where you might find the symptoms are acting up when I don't defend myself, or when I don't stand by what I believe, or I, let somebody get away with something that I didn't feel so good about, or when I make a choice that I didn't want to make. It doesn't have to be about interactions with other people. So there, the symptoms are communicating something.
How do you work with uncertainty, especially when people are really afraid of not knowing? That's basically what you're talking about. We have some people who, for example, if I go to the next question, how do you work with OCD, general anxiety disorder? We often find these alongside neuroplastic pain. Can we see OCD symptoms and general anxiety as neuroplastic symptoms? If so, how do you treat them? Donc, comment travaillez-vous avec la notion d'incertitude dont on parlait tout à l'heure? Surtout quand les gens ont vraiment peur de ne pas savoir. Et comment travaillez-vous avec les TOC, les troubles anxieux généralisés? On les retrouve souvent associés aux douleurs neuroplastiques. Peut-on les considérer comme des symptômes neuroplastiques? Et si oui, comment les traitez-vous? Donc, uncertainty, OCD, general anxiety disorder.
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is this. My goal with uncertainty is to get rid of it. I like to provide information and get the person in that personal way, connecting to their mind, what works for them, to get to a place where they can feel certain. My book is called Crushing Doubt. It is about getting doubt down to almost zero. My podcast as well, Crushing Doubt. So the idea here is that a lot of people think you just have to live with uncertainty. And there are some things we have to live with some uncertainty about. Of course, we don't know what happens after death. We don't understand why certain things happen. There's going to be some uncertainty, but there's a lot less uncertainty than I thought. When I started learning about these concepts, I realized no, some uncertainty is simply not having the right information.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can give the right information, and we can even call into question, do we need to stay uncertain about this?
Mm-hmm.
We can make huge gains.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I have 3 columns, but the reason that my book and my podcast and everything is called Crushing Doubt is because the overarching concept of these columns is to understand what's happening. We need to understand. Uncertainty is very uncomfortable. We've got enough of it out there. You walk out the door, you don't know what's going to happen. We've got enough uncertainty out there, but we can become certain about the things that we know, and there's so much more that we can be certain about than people realize. And it's the science and the logic that provides that information. So I work on getting people to certainty, first about their symptoms and then about themselves. Doubt is work on certainty with symptoms. I'm clear on why this is happening. I'm clear on what to do about it. Then there's getting to certainty about, I know it's this emotion in me that caused that symptom, or I know that it's me being out of alignment with myself that causes this. So that's the first answer to your question about uncertainty. Now let me get into OCD and generalized anxiety disorder and that sort of thing.
Because there's a lot of anxiety, chronic pain, neuroplastic pain. There's always anxiety.
Yeah, well, first of all, how are you not going to be anxious if you're in chronic pain?
Il y a toujours de l'anxiété quand on a un symptôme ou une douleur chronique.
It's very, very hard. I was not only anxious, I was in panic a lot of the time. I was like, my peers aren't going through this. They don't know why this is happening. They say I'm not going to get better. I have no reason to think I'll get better. How are you not going to have anxiety in that situation? So what I have come to see, and I just continue to explore this more and more, I just stay curious and ask questions and learn more and more. That's being a good scientist as far as I'm concerned. And what I've found is that obsessive thoughts, anxiety, depression, those are symptoms. They're symptoms just like any other physical symptom. And if we start to treat them that way, instead of treating it as like mental illness or something like that, which is a term I've never loved, for many reasons. But one is I don't think it is an illness, and I also don't think it is a trait that people have, or a disease or a disorder. I don't believe in any of that. So I believe that people have obsessive compulsive tendencies. I don't believe in the disorder, because To me, the disorder is simply the symptoms are revved super high. If you can bring the symptoms down, then you don't have OCD. But people do have obsessive and compulsive tendencies because they're having those very active symptoms. So I work with people all the time on these things. An obsession, just as an example, is a symptom. If you're continuing to think about something, guess what? There's a reason for it. It could be that your doubt column is all revved up and you don't know how to think differently and you don't have any way to feel safe. So that protective function is going to be going and going and going. That's one of the reasons obsessions happen. I'm in danger. I have no reason to think I can get better. I got to think my way out of this. Think.
Mm.
And the obsessions continue. So if I can bring down doubt, I can treat those obsessions. Sometimes obsessions happen because they are the symptom that's there to distract from the emotion. So you can sometimes be having an obsession where it's happening because I don't want to know about this emotional experience. And if you can know about that emotional experience, suddenly you don't need the obsession anymore. So that can go away. You can also treat it with the power column. Obsessions can happen sometimes at times where people are about to expand into power. They just got a new job. Their book just came out. They just got into a new relationship, or they moved in with the person that they are with. Those are power expansions. And if we're not comfortable with them or we're worried about them, we can then start to obsess. So the three columns are, to me, a great way of just sifting through very quickly what's happening. And that's true with any symptom. Obsessions, compulsions, anxiety, depression, you name it.
Quel est un des symptômes les plus étranges que vous ayez rencontrés dans votre pratique?
So listen, even the term strange is going to vary person to person. So I'm actually going to give you a couple of examples because some will sound stranger to some than others.
I'm asking this question because so many people say that can't be neuroplastic, this can't be neuroplastic. Parce que je pose cette question parce que beaucoup de gens te disent mais c'est pas possible, ce symptôme-là, ça peut pas être neuroplastique.
So I'm going to give you a list of them, a list of some of the stranger ones. I'm going to put in quotes because I don't actually think any of it's strange.
Yeah.
I understand it could be seen that way, but I've seen people who have, they're called fasciculations, where their muscles are twitching and they're just twitching like all over, or maybe in one specific area. My brother once had a symptom where he felt that there was like a burning hot coin on his thigh, a very specific place, out of nowhere. Or people can develop like severe eczema suddenly on their hands. People can have dry eyes out of nowhere. People can get actual nosebleeds because of this. Here's some of the stranger ones, and I've experienced most of these, by the way, in one form or another. You can suddenly have a strange taste in your mouth. Didn't taste anything, didn't put any food in your mouth, and suddenly you're like, it tastes like garlic.
Yeah,
What's
that's your
happening?
brain. That's your cerveau.
There can be like a kind of irritated patch of skin up here, and a dermatologist might look at it and be like, I don't see anything. So your whole body is expressing your mind all the time. There are no weird symptoms, actually. I mean, I understand that people could see it that way, but yeah.
For you, when did the split between body and mind happen in Western medicine, and why did it happen? Quand et pourquoi la séparation entre le corps et l'esprit s'est-elle produite en médecine occidentale pour vous? Et pourquoi?
Okay, so there have actually been a couple of different splits that happen, and I'm just going to describe them. The first thing I want to say is there's a lot of knowledge throughout the history of humanity that speaks to the fact that the mind and the body are one. In my book, I go through the history of philosophy and literature, and I show we've basically known this connection our whole experience. Throughout the human written experience, anyway, we have evidence that people knew about this connection. But then there were certain times where splits happened. One of them was actually René Descartes, who I'm sure you are all familiar with. There was a philosophy called dualism. It wasn't only Descartes, but he was a very big spokesperson for it. And he started talking about how the mind and the body are two different entities. You can really separate out the two. And I think some of that was a wish, because there are uncomfortable things about what goes on in the mind. And we would rather just split it off into the body. So this is a psychological defense. And we can at least trace it back to Descartes. We can probably trace it back much further than that. In fact, there was, I think, dualistic principles even in like some of what Plato said, I think, if I look back far enough. But so there are all these splits. But when did the split really become huge? So Dr. Sarno, I love this guy. He saved my life with his books, and he said so many great things. But one of the great things that he said, which cleared it up for me, is why did this split happen in modern medicine recently? And where that came from was from a technological advancement. We started to have much better imaging techniques to be able to see what was going on inside the body. So we were seeing a lot more. And we thought we knew what that meant, what we were seeing, but we were misinterpreting what we're seeing. So there was the X-ray, but the MRI was the one that really led to this split. And MRIs, by the way, can be incredibly fantastic. They can catch tumors that we would not see otherwise. They're saving lives all the time. I'm not meaning to malign any of the technology, but as with any technology, we need to know how to use it. And what was happening is people would see these MRIs and they'd be like, well, that doesn't look right. And that doesn't look right. And we were starting to see what are actually normal abnormalities, I'll put in quotes, as something that was structural damage or a big problem. And so we would interpret wear and tear as if this is a real problem in the body. It all came from dualism, because if we're not split off, we would look at that and be like, yeah, that's just what's happening in the body. But like, is that an actual problem, or is that
Yeah, like arthritis,
relatively
for
normal?
example, comme l'arthrose, par exemple.
That's right. Arthritis is actually a prime example. When I was growing up, the word arthritis, the number one association that anyone would have to arthritis is pain. In fact, most people don't even really know what arthritis is. I don't mean that dismissively of them. I didn't. I had to start looking into it. I just knew it was this thing that caused pain that older people get. That was what I had heard. And it's not actually highly correlated with pain at all. In fact, there's not much correlation. One thing that we found, this started around the 1990s. So the MRI, I believe, was invented in the 60s, but I need to check my numbers on that. But this split was starting to happen. More and more and more people were just thinking structurally. They were treating our bodies as if we're cars, and doctors were becoming auto mechanics. You'd come in and they'd just look at the body and say what's happening here and how do we fix it. And all these surgeries started to happen. You see it in professional athletes all the time. They're having all these surgeries to repair. And sometimes the surgeries are necessary if there's like a completely torn ligament or something like that. But there's all of these procedures that are happening. This is such a deep topic, Jasmine, because it also gets into things like the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industries. Like, how are we dealing with health? A lot of times it's completely backwards. How we're dealing with the problem is dictating what we do about the problem. But we've already made the decision not based on what's actually happening. We're getting away from diagnosing the problem and figuring out what to do. Instead, we're thinking about the procedures that need to fix the body and then just wedging a diagnosis into that situation. It's completely backwards.
Yeah.
So the split really goes back to those imaging techniques and not understanding what we're seeing. I have people say to me all the time things like, well, you're saying this is a mind body or a neuroplastic experience, but if you look on the MRI, it's right there. Look, there's a tear right here. And I often say back to people like that, yeah, I'm not saying it's not there. And I'm not saying it's not real. What I'm saying is that it's not relevant. And the reason it's not relevant is they started studying asymptomatic people with no symptoms in the 90s. And what they found is tons and tons of people with no symptoms have a complete train wreck of an MRI. They have all those same structural issues. Dr. Sarno actually described an example in one of his books, one of my favorite examples. It was a guy who had terrible hip pain, and they looked at his hip on X-ray, and there was a ton of arthritis. And Dr. Sarno said, do me a favor. Let's do an X-ray of the good hip. They did an x-ray of the good hip. It looked exactly the same. So these are the kinds of things that we need to realize. We're not understanding what it is we're seeing. We need to continue with the science. We can't trust these machines and whatever the data printout is above our own brains. If it's not consistent with the rest of the data, that's not good science.
So in French, we have one word, esprit. And it expresses both the mind and the spirit. In English, we have two words, spirit, that comes from the Latin spiritus, that means the breath, and we have, or the life force, and we have the mind, which refers to our cognitive and thinking capacity. Do you think this linguistic difference reflects something deeper about how our cultures relate to the mind-body connection? Donc, en français, nous avons un seul mot, esprit, pour exprimer à la fois mind et spirit. En anglais, ce sont deux mots distincts. Spirit vient du latin spiritus, qui signifie souffle et force vitale, tandis que le mot mind désigne notre capacité cognitive et de penser. Donc en français, on a juste le mot esprit pour dire ce qu'on dit en anglais mind et ce qu'ils disent aussi spirit, l'esprit. Pensez-vous que cette différence linguistique reflète quelque chose de plus profond dans la façon dont nos cultures appréhendent la connexion corps-esprit?
Yeah, I would say words are far more important than people realize because the words are feeding what's going on in our brains.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to thinking, what we're thinking is all about what we're hearing. So if you're hearing the word esprit, it's part of your considerations. In America, I will tell you, there is not a lot of thinking that way. There's not even a word for it, really. I mean, even the word like mind body that we've been grappling with, like, what does it really mean? Do people really like that word? Or the word neuroplastic. Some people think, well, that's too jargonese, too scientific sounding. It would be great if we had a word that just merged everything. And then there are different cultures that have totally different words.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think it's great that you guys that the English language has two words. Because moi, je trouve que c'est bien qu'il y ait deux mots. Un, le mot qui parle un peu du mental, mais aussi qui inclut les processus, voilà, tout ce qui est émotion, mais aussi le mot esprit. Moi, je trouve ça bien qu'en anglais, qu'il y ait les deux mots. I think it's good that the English language has two words because if you only had one word that was spirit, the spirit-body connection.
Yeah.
You would miss the cognitive, you would miss the, right?
Yeah, well, actually, this is interesting because look what just happened right here. This shows you the power of words. I thought you were saying that esprit is this really helpful word, but it also has some limitations.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if things are merged, there are words and phrases from different languages that just they do not exist in other languages. I mean, one of the French ones that comes to mind is je ne sais quoi. It's a great, or déjà vu. That's another one. They are describing a very particular thing. And obviously we can borrow things from each other's language, but if we don't have the language or we have limiting language, it can really throw things off. I'll give you a great example of that. The word structural. The word structural, it means the structures of things. Now, but if it's applied to the body, here's another thing. That word has a lot of implied meaning. So some of it is what meaning we put on the words. When people in America hear the word structural, they mean, first of all, any thoughts about the mind or the brain having a role are just gone. It's just like, it's just starting to think about the body as a car again. Only structural. So it becomes a very limiting word. It doesn't have to be limiting, but if we don't pay attention to what the language is saying and what our interpretations are of it, we're going to be locked into that understanding. Whereas there are other words like, in Chinese medicine, the qi, it's like a life force. It flows. There's all kinds of things that, in Western culture, we don't think about. And I'm not saying Eastern culture is better than Western culture, or even that there are Eastern or Western cultures so definitively. But there are all kinds of really great concepts that can open up space to think about things differently.
And just to add another question with the importance of words, juste pour ajouter une question de l'importance des mots, the diagnosis that people get from the doctors, the words that they hear will create a trajectory for them. Le diagnostic, les mots qui sont utilisés dans les diagnostics créent un chemin qu'ils vont emprunter, qui est prédéfini.
Absolutely. There was a study by a guy named Richard Deo in which they studied what happened with symptoms in patients who received their MRI results. And pretty routinely, the people who received their MRI results got worse. Just from knowing, just from hearing the words. So that's the thing. If we make it structural and we show you this scary looking picture, you're going to freak out. And a diagnosis, especially if there's like a prognosis involved, it has a huge impact. We're finding this with cancer treatments. There's so many things we don't understand about cancer. There's people who outlive the prognosis by a lot. But think about what it does to your brain when you get a prognosis that's bad. You've got bad expectations going on. And that's what happened for me with my back pain. I went to a doctor, and the first time I went to a doctor, and I asked this question. I wanted reassurance. I asked her, am I going to have this for the rest of my life? I wanted to hear, no, listen, we'll figure this out. And you know what she said? She said, probably. That
one word,
probably.
un mot.
This is one of the reasons I am so vigilant against doubt, because one word can send people reeling for months and months and months, years potentially. So we got to be careful with our language. I do my best. Language is tough because people could interpret it a certain way, but I think it's really important that we help people not have doubt. And one word can send you in the direction of, I don't think I can get better.
C'est un peu biaisé, c'est-à-dire un mot difficile peut vous faire vraiment tomber très fort, très dur, alors qu'un mot d'encouragement ou d'espoir ne pourra pas réduire complètement vos symptômes immédiatement.
Do you mean, are the bad words more potent than the good words? I would say that the bad words have a much easier pathway.
Yeah.
When there's bad words, there's something called the nocebo effect, which is the opposite of the placebo effect, which is when you believe something good will happen and then it actually happens in the body because of it. The nocebo effect is the opposite. You believe something bad's going to happen and then it transpires in the body, which, by the way, both are proof of the mind-body process right there, a neuroplastic process. It's much easier to scare somebody very quickly and to get them all activated than to calm them down and have them feel good. So that's part of the uphill battle of some of this. That being said, speaking of words, I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that those good words can become much more potent and they can become faster acting. As doubt comes down, that's what happens. We start to reverse this.
Yeah.
The good words start to help more. The bad words start to infiltrate less. So that can change. I just want to say that. But I think, the concept of entropy, which is like the tendency of the universe towards disorder, it speaks to this too. A bad word has a much easier job. Wrecking things is easier than building things.
Exactly. Into fixing, right?
But if we're thinking about things the right way, we are protected against all that wrecking.
Yes.
And we can build things much
Exactly.
faster.
It's all also about your habit, catching your thoughts, catching how you talk about things, how you talk about your symptoms. There's some very interesting Facebook groups that, for example, for ME, there's a Facebook group that totally bans negative talking. C'est très intéressant. Donc, la façon dont on va parler de nos symptômes va forcément influencer aussi comment on se sent. Et il y a un groupe Facebook, justement, sur le syndrome de fatigue chronique qui interdit la négativité dans le groupe.
Yeah, and one person saying one scary thing could scare thousands of people.
Yes.
So I think it would be important to say it's not really about suppressing those things, but more, I have a rule in my groups, and it's own your own doubt. And so what that means is you can talk about negative things, but own it as a doubt, because what that does is it protects everyone else from thinking this is true. No, this isn't true. This is a worry. I'm saying a worry.
we're almost at the end of the interview. I have two more questions, two, three. What research is currently exciting you the most? Quelles sont les recherches qui vous enthousiasment le plus en ce moment?
Um, there's tons of research that's exciting me, but the thing I'm most excited about is the research that's not even, it's just being dreamed of now, because we're getting to a point now where more and more people are starting to understand, or at least entertain or learn about these concepts. And what that's going to do is open up the kind of research that can be done. So I will say, though, one of the most exciting pieces of research was the Boulder back pain study. It was a fantastic study that showed that the correlation between structural and pain mechanisms was actually very low. There's not a correlation in most cases. I think the study showed that 88% of the cases that showed up, there was no correlation. And even when there was a correlation, it doesn't mean causation.
Mm-hmm.
It just 88% didn't even have a correlation at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I mean, one of the reasons that that study was so exciting is, first of all, it showed that neuroplastic or mind-body treatment did a better job in dealing with these problems than physical or structural treatments. But it even showed that these mind-body or neuroplastic treatments did a better job than cognitive behavioral treatments. It's like a specific form of dealing with these really helped. So it was a study that identified what I do, even though we all have some variations in how we do it. What we do in the mind-body neuroplastic field works. I will say one other piece of research that's very exciting to me, because it's actually about the columns themselves. I work with a wonderful doctor in Israel, Efrat Saraki, and she and her team are bringing in people who mostly war veterans and people with lots of trauma history. And they're doing research on, well, what happens? Where's your doubt at the start? Where's your doubt at the end? Did it help with the pain? And so, for my own personal work, that's something I'm very excited about. And I would love to see all kinds of studies done about what can be controlled by these methods, what shows that this really works. I mean, if I had all the time in the world, I'd be conducting a lot of research studies. I'll work on it.
You have hours in the day, I'm sure, that where you're not
If I
doing
don't
anything.
sleep.
What role does creativity play in the healing process and more broadly in our lives as human beings? Quel rôle joue la créativité dans le processus de guérison et plus largement dans nos vies en tant qu'être humain? That's a whole podcast hour as well. Ça, c'est juste
Right. Well, all of these questions are, you've asked brilliant questions. I do particularly love this one, though, because it really captures what's so important about our individuality and our humanity and our creativity. And it also speaks to my personal experience, because what I found is when I was having the 8 years of back pain, my creativity was way down. I didn't have time or energy to focus on that. I was just fighting a battle for my life, or just to be able to function or not have pain. I wasn't thinking about creative things much during that time period. And when I got better, I had a creative outburst that was just gigantic. I just was like, I've been creating things ever since. And that speaks to my concept of the power column, is just one way of looking at it. I discovered that I wanted to do all kinds of creative things, and I could do certain things that I didn't think I could do. A great example of that is I played guitar and sang. I started playing guitar when I was 21. I sang before then, but I would just sing covers. I had no concept that I could write my own songs. None. And then I got better from back pain, had a big falling out with that not so great analyst, and stepped into my own power. And all kinds of things started happening. I actually got involved briefly with a talk show as the mental health expert, and that felt like a creative endeavor. But one of the things that happened through that process is I started to believe in myself as someone who had something to express that was unique. So when you ask, what role does it play in the healing process? Creativity is your way of expressing who you are. There's only one you. And if we want to be in power and aligned with ourselves, we need to be expressing who we are.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be through music. It could be
It's
through painting. It could be through writing. It could be through any kind of creative endeavor.
cooking, the way
Cooking,
you
yeah,
choose your clothes, the way you take care of your friends, la façon dont on s'occupe de ses amis, la façon dont on cuisine.
sure.
On n'est pas obligé d'investir
You
pour être
could
dans la
you could create
créativité.
you could create a business or invent something, like
Mm,
or create a game. I mean, there's
mm,
there's endless ways to do it, but if you're not expressing who you are, your body's going to be expressing its distress about that.
yeah.
I have this rule of thumb in my column system, which is there's a flow to things. First, you got to bring down the doubt. You got to get to a place where you're not afraid, confused, lacking certainty, or even have unanswered questions. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you got to bring it down pretty far. Then you learn about the emotions. Get that emotional awareness. And then finally, everything flows towards power.
Mm,
And that fits with what you're asking here. The end goal of it all is that your body wants you to align with you. And that
mm,
includes expressing who you are.
mm. Somebody says, but
Usually.
I don't know who I am. Et si quelqu'un vous dit, mais je ne sais pas qui je suis parce que j'ai passé tellement d'années à souffrir, if someone says, I don't know who I am because I spent my whole life suffering.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a story that many people have had. It's a
Yes.
story that I had. I wouldn't have said at the time, by the way, that I didn't know who I was. I thought I did know who I was. And what I found is, no, I didn't.
Mm,
I knew what I was like. I knew about like a collection of identity pieces or traits,
mhm,
but I didn't know who I was at my core. I didn't know like what
mhm,
was so important to me. The last
mhm,
chapter of my book, I talk about something called core mind body values. It's a mouthful, but the main way of thinking about it is your mind and your body can tell you who you are. If you
mhm,
really study what they're saying, all that suffering becomes intelligible. All that suffering it's intelligible.
mhm.
You can come to understand what it's telling you about who you are.
Ouais.
So when people don't know who they are or feel that
Mhm,
they couldn't or don't even know what that means, I say to people, let's find out. Let's find out what your body's telling us. Let's use these columns to decode it all, and you'll see like, oh, I was somebody who was really emotionally neglected, and
mhm,
who I am is somebody who doesn't ever want to do that to anybody now.
mhm, mhm,
And I'm going to, create a school for kids that
mhm.
is very not neglectful of kids all the time.
Yeah.
That's channeling you out into the universe. So suffering can really limit our sense of who we can be. But if we can come to understand the suffering and know that we can get it under control, we can discover much more who we are.
And what you just said is also very, very, very interesting because a lot of people, when they go through a long episode of pain, they just want to go back to who they were because they can't project a better version of them, a more knowledgeable, a more compassionate, a more. They just say, I just miss what I had. Beaucoup de gens,
Yes.
quand ils
Yeah.
traversent une période très longue de douleur, ils veulent juste retourner à qui était avant. Ils n'arrivent pas à se projeter en disant, mais en fait, je vais sortir de ça avec encore plus de connaissances, avoir encore plus d'affirmations, etc. Ils veulent retourner dans qui ils étaient.
Yeah. I would say this. When I got better from my suffering, I didn't go back to who I was.
Mais we
I
can't,
went
on
back
peut
to
pas.
some things, but I went to something better. There were changes that happened, but they were all good changes. There were things that were not serving me well, or I, just didn't feed me. There were a lot of ways I also learned to take care of people in a better way
Mm.
that wasn't always sacrificing myself. Still, I actually think I take care of people even better than I did before, but I
Mm.
also take care of me better than I did. I know me better. I'm living a more aligned life. I most of the things I'm doing are things that are really important to me. I don't, I'll do things I have to do. But other than that, I'm living in things that are really important to me. And it's really important that people connect with themselves that way. And
Yeah.
don't necessarily you can go back to things that you want. I mean, I went back to playing basketball. I'm still a basketball player. I still care about music at the same level, maybe even more. But now I'm also somebody who can write songs, and now I'm somebody who runs a basketball league. It's there's expansion that's possible.
Because the last question is, what is a message of hope for people listening? And I think that is a great conclusion, seeing a good message of hope.
Yeah, though I will say one other thing. Just a short message of hope. I like to tell people, you make sense and your symptoms make sense. Even if you don't think it does make sense and you can't figure it out, it can be made sense of. And the columns are just one of the methods that I think are a great method, but there's many methods to get there. But don't lose sight of the fact that you can make sense of your symptoms and who you are.
But they hate them so much. A lot of people despise their symptoms so much. Beaucoup de gens détestent leurs symptômes.
So let me add, when I say you make sense and your symptoms make sense, I don't mean you have to keep having the symptoms. I don't mean that you have to keep having the symptoms. When we make sense of the symptoms, you get rid of them. That's why I'm saying you make sense and your symptoms make sense. Because once you do understand them, you can make them go away and start to live your life.
This is the end of the interview. I just want to show your book, The Crushing Doubt book, which came out not too long ago.
Yeah, last January.
It's not in French yet. Il n'est pas encore en français. It's not in French yet, but that is a project. Ça, c'est un beau projet de l'avoir en français.
Yes, I can't wait to get it into French. And if you can help me with that, Jasmine, let me know.
We're gonna make it happen. Il est rempli d'informations, le travail des colonnes, mais sur l'histoire de Dan, tout son parcours et comment il a compris les différentes approches de psychologie par rapport au travail qu'il fait, comment il a tout réussi à combiner. It really talks about your life and what you went through and all the different. It's a very personal book. C'est un livre très personnel.
Yes, I love sharing it with people because I think it helps people know I really get this. I mean, I lived it and I got out and I'm fine.
And you're fine. Voilà, une très belle fin pour cette interview, and that's the perfect ending. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much for being with us, and we really hope everybody who will be able to listen I'm sure will get so much knowledge, hope, and just be able to breathe a little bit. Je pense que votre interview permet aux gens un peu de respirer, donne de l'espoir encore une fois et des connaissances. Et on espère vous revoir bientôt, and we hope to see you soon again here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thanks everybody for listening.
Bye.